What's up, Code Slingers? Today we're going to talk about CSS. More specifically, the CSS property of display. There are so many display properties, we can't cover all of them in one video. So we'll only be covering the basics, and we won't include advanced display properties such as flex or grid, as those need to be covered in their own video. So we're only going to be looking at the most basic properties that you'll be using in your everyday life. So our properties are block, contents, inherit, inline, inline-block, and none, but not in that order. So we're going to start off with DisplayBlock. So in our DisplayBlock HTML document, we just have a div and a span, and our div is set to DisplayBlock. And in our CSS, we are setting our block to DisplayBlock, giving it a background color of green, and we have a width and a height, which I'm going to remove first. And then we can view this in the browser. So in our browser, we can see our two elements. So our first element is set to DisplayBlock. So it takes up the entire width of our screen. So any other element will be pushed to be below our DisplayBlock element. And even if we change the width of our block, it won't matter. We can set the width to something like 30%, and this won't matter. As you can see, there's plenty of space next to our block element, but it doesn't allow our element below it to exist in that space, as our block element will always take up the entire width of our block element. So if we use our dev tools, so in Chrome you can press F12 or use right click and say inspect. You can click this little mouse cursor here at the bottom, and if we inspect our block element, we can see it is 30% in width, but the rest of our space is covered with margins, so no other element can exist next to a block element unless you use display flex, but that's something for another video. Even if this is a span that is set to display inline, that inline element will be pushed to exist below our block level element. One thing to know about block level elements are that you can change their height and width manually. So you can change its height, let's say 200 pixels. And as you can see, we changed the height of our element. We can manually set this, unlike with inline elements. And also, if you add a border, padding, or margin, our block level element will acknowledge that border, padding, or margin and adjust the size of its container to account for that extra bit of size. So if we add a border of, let's say, 50 pixels and solid, let's make it yellow. As you can see, our document accommodates for that extra space and our element gets pushed underneath. So it gets wrapped by our border and there are no discrepancies. This behaves exactly as you might think. So here, the size of our container is whatever is inside and whatever width and height you set it, plus the extra border, padding, or margin. Of course, you can change this with the box sizing property, but this is really important to note as we'll look at our inline display property later. Now let's look at our display inline. So our inline elements only take up the amount of width and height that they need to exist in our document. As you can see, our inline element does not span the entire width of our screen. It only takes up the space that it needs. Also, unlike with block elements, you cannot change the height and width of inline elements. So you can set the width to whatever you want and the height to also whatever you want, and it will not work. Our inline element will not grow bigger because the height and width cannot be set manually. It is only controlled by the content or the size of the content that's inside our inline container. It's also worthy to note that if you add something like border, padding, or margin, our document will ignore this and won't consider it as a part of the natural flow. So as you can see, we have a border around our element, but the top border gets cut off. So it's overflowing the top because our inline element only keeps track of whatever is inside and not outside. Also, another thing to note is that inline elements only keep track of the content that's next to them and not below them. So if you add another element next to our inline element and it's an inline block element, and if you push it down, the content of this element will be in line with the content of our other element, not the container itself. So if we show you an example over here, so as you can see here, we have an inline block element next to our inline element. Obviously, you can't have a block level element next to our inline element, since the block element will take up the entire width. So with our inline element, we have a padding top that we can see here. And our inline element is not centered or in line with the container. It's in line with the content of the container that's next to it. So that is something to keep in mind when you set something to display inline. Whatever is next to it, it will be in line with the content and not the container of whatever is next to it. Also know that if you have a border or padding or margin, our inline element will ignore any element that is on top or below it. So that padding or margin will go over the element next to it, or at least underneath it and on top of it. That border will, however, have an effect on the element that is next to it, since it's keeping track of that element, or at least the content inside that element. Next, let's look at our inline block element. So we have one div with some text inside of it, and we have our inline block element that is set to inline block with a background color of pink. So if we look at our document, this is what we have. Currently, it is the entire width of our screen because we have too much text. So if we reduce the size of our text, we can see that it only takes up the amount of width and height that it needs to display the document in the browser. But unlike inline elements, you can set the height and width that you want it to be. So we can set the height to 200 and the width to, let's say, 600. And as you can see, we can control the height and the width with an inline block element. Also, inline blocks will keep track of the elements on top, below, and to the right and to the left of it. So if we add a border of 50 pixels, solid black, you can see that like a block element, it pushes our container down to account for our extra border. Unlike the inline element that at the top and the bottom will ignore that extra border. Like I said before, inline elements will, however, keep track of the border left and right, since it needs to keep track of the content that is left and right of the inline element. Inline block behaves more like a block, but it only takes the amount of space it needs unless you specify a specific height or width for it. Next, let's look at DisplayNone. So in DisplayNone, we have two divs below each other, and in our CSS, we just have a DisplayNone class. With currently our DisplayNone is commented out, so we can see it in our browser. So we can see our top div and our bottom div. So as we can see, our top div says I'm going to disappear, and our bottom div says I'm going to replace you. That's because when you use DisplayNone, not only does it make the element invisible, the DOM completely ignores that element. So whatever element was below it will replace that element, or at least pretend that it doesn't exist. This is quite useful for when you want to make drop-down menus or animation. So if we say here display none, and we need to save it probably, as you can see, our top element completely disappeared and we only have our bottom element that's left. So now let's look at our display contents. Display contents isn't something you're going to use every day, but it is useful to know about it. So I did want to cover it in this video. So first, let's look at what we have. So if we remove the display content, this will behave like a normal display block element, since divs are by default display block. And now if we add display contents, we can see we no longer have the background color. Well, that's because in display contents, it works very similar to display none, but instead of making the entire element disappear, it only makes the parent element disappear. So the content inside that element still gets displayed. So if we look at our HTML, here our div with a class of contents disappears. So the browser pretends as if this element doesn't exist, and our text gets displayed directly in the body. So instead of our text being the child of our div, our text is now being seen by the browser as the child of our body, which doesn't have a background color. That's why it doesn't show a background color, because it pretends this div doesn't exist. So we can completely remove it. And that is exactly as the browser views our document, but we're just going to add this back for now. So you can do that if you want. Like I said before, you're not going to use this very often, but it is there if you want to use it. Lastly, we're going to look at DisplayInherit. So in our HTML element, we have a div container with a class of inherit. And in that container, we have two spans. So if we look at our CSS, we're grabbing our spans, so span 1 and span 2, and giving them a background color. We have inherit currently commented out. So what DisplayInherit does, it allows whatever child is inside, so whatever we put the DisplayInherit on, to inherit its display property from its parent. Currently, span elements have a display property of inline, and divs have a display property of block. So let's look at the browser. As you can see, we have our inline span in yellow and our second inline span also in yellow. So as you can see, they are currently inline elements as they are inline. And if we add inherit to our first span, you can see that our first span becomes a block level element. That's because its parent container is a block. And with inherit, it's inheriting that display property from its parent. So if we add the second DisplayInherit to our second span, and we probably need to save it, you can see that now both our elements are display block because they're inheriting this from their parent. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you like this video, please like. If there's any other CSS properties or JavaScript that you want me to cover, please tell me in the comments below. I hope this video helped you out a lot, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.